What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another offseason report, another week. No, I'm not working this week, but I am working this week. Figure that out for yourself. Wide receivers week, huge week for Ohio State. The best position group in college football. No single position group, in my opinion, is better than the Ohio State wide receivers. I look at the Georgia defensive line. I look at, people say like the Texas quarterback room. They used to talk about the Michigan offensive line. There's not a single group in the country that's better at its specific position than the Ohio State wide receivers. Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming. Oh, by the way, Marvin Harrison Jr., Carnell Tate on the rise, Brandon Innes incoming, Xavier Johnson, another weapon. The list goes on and on and on, and that's why we're here to talk about it. Andy Backstrom, the 40-year vet Tim May. You know the whole crew by now. It is wide receivers week, fellas. It's a huge week. This is one of my favorite weeks of the year. I love breaking down this position because you just never know how these guys are going to line up. You never know what the production's going to be. You never know who the next guy in line is going to be. We thought Jackson Smith-Njigba was going to have an amazing year last year. Nope, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka tallied 2,400 yards receiving together. It's just a never-ending factory, Tim, of wide receiver talent that Brian Hartline gets to work with because he's so good at this recruiting thing.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, is it the guys he's recruiting? Is it the preparation they get? What has gotten these guys, for example, like watching Emeka Egbuka and Marvin Harrison Jr. play in the Rose Bowl when Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson opted out. Boom, they stepped up into the bright lights. Obviously, the star of the show was Jackson Smith-Njigba, but Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka showed they were not afraid of prime time, because that game did go through prime time on the east side, on the eastern end of the United States of America. But the bottom line is, who's ready to do that same thing now? Well, right now, this time a year ago, Jackson Smith-Njigba, boy, there was even a little bit of a speculation he might even make a run for the Heisman if, in fact, he carries through like he did in that Rose Bowl. Next thing you know, he played parts of 3 games, and that was it for Jackson Smith-Njigba. Are they going to escape the injury bug or the jinx, whatever you want to call it, for the 3 major guys that are coming back, including Julian Fleming? We're going to get to see. But my goodness, Carnell Tate and Noah Rogers both looked the part in the spring. They've been on campus for a week at that point, a couple of weeks. And now they're spending even more time with Brian Hartline. They're getting bigger, faster, and stronger under the auspices of Mickey Marotti and his staff. You're right. I mean, this is as deep a room as we've seen, and it just keeps refilling, like a pool, like an infinity pool. There's no end to it.
Andy, it's weird to think about because we talked about the best wide receiver room in 2021. Last year, we talked about it in 2022. I think this group has a chance to rival that 2021 group that featured Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. Jackson Smith-Njigba led that team in receiving, as weird as it is to say, considering the rookie year we just saw from Garrett and Chris. This group has a chance to rival that if it all stays together. Emeka is a special player, Emeka Egbuka. Marvin Harrison Jr. obviously is super special. Julian Fleming, when healthy, has proven he can be very special. The sky's the limit for this group. Just general overview of it before we really dive in as a group here.
Yeah, I feel like every major outlet right now is having Marvin Harrison Jr. at 1, Emeka Egbuka at 2, not just within Ohio State, but the entire country for wide receivers and what looks like to be the top 2 wide receivers taken in the 2024 NFL draft. A little bit ways out right now, but it certainly seems like that's possible. And like Spencer said, rivaling the 2021 group, having 2 first-round picks potentially in next year's draft would be the same thing as we saw with Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. So it's certainly possible they could rival that group. And then Julian Fleming, I think, it kind of gets overlooked towards the end of last year. He was really good. He started out really well, then had some injury problems. But then at the end of the year, had 5 catches against Michigan, had 5 catches against Georgia, and was really good on third down. He had 22 first down conversions for Ohio State last year, which is critical for a third wide receiver on your team. He can play outside. He can also play in the slot, but he's like 6'2", which is really good size for a wideout. They can play both inside and out. And he gives some great versatility. I know Brian Hartline's really high on Julian Fleming. He's really the one that gets overlooked, but was the highest recruited of all of these guys, really, was just such a highly touted recruit coming out of high school. So the top 3 is legit. The question is, who's number 4? Is it Xavier Johnson? Is it going to be Jaden Ballard? Is it going to be Carnell Tate? Is it going to be anyone else? And I think that's going to be, the endless discussion for Ohio State wide receivers. Who's number 4? And it's a really good problem to have. And you can go any way you want with that conversation, really.
Yeah, it's almost the thing of like, who's next on the depth chart, but who's next in line. They're almost two different talking points. Like Jaden Ballard might be 4th on the depth chart, but Carnell Tate is next in line as far as like that guy's going to be a first-round pick. So like, just because, and I do think that Jaden Ballard's going to earn some playing time. Brian Hartline talked really glowingly of him this offseason of like this, he's taken that step where we wanted him to be last season. He's finally there this spring. I think he's going to earn some playing time, but like, just because he might be 4th on the depth chart doesn't mean he's got the top end talent I think that Carnell Tate has, if that makes any sense. And I think it's also interesting, and we're going to get into this more when we talk about the freshmen down the video, but like they were already mentioning Brandon Ennis in March, and he wasn't even slated to arrive until June. That tells you everything you need to know. They know when he gets to campus, he's going to be good. And so, they expect that from him. It's not just like, well, if he's good, we might be able to work him in. Like they expect it. But at the same time, you look at the top of the depth chart, Tim, not much room for other guys on the field when you've got Marvin, Emeka, and Julian. And we've already talked about the tight ends. We've already talked about the running backs. It's going to be hard to get any of these other wide receivers on the field without hurting yourself by taking one of the top 3 off the field.
Yeah, they might even throw Evan Pryor out there at wide receiver. No, I'm just messing with you. I'm messing with you, but folks who've been watching these understand. Yeah, I let's keep looking at Jaden Ballard. It kind of reminds me when I talk about the Ohio State safeties, when I do radio and TV and all this kind of stuff. You talk about guys and then you leave guys out that you didn't mean to leave out, because this is not gushing, this is true. There is a wealth of talent at Ohio State right now in the skill spots. Getting these guys to play and play to their potential is the challenge. On the offensive side of the ball, Jaden Ballard is the challenge for Brian Hartline. There is no doubt about this guy's talent and ability when he's consistent and 100% there. And that's a guy that could really be one of those, where did he come from, dudes, as this season progresses? Or if he doesn't, where did he go, dudes? Because time waits for no man when it comes to the wide receiver room. We already saw two highly talented dudes, the Calebs, leave town since this past in the past 6 months, and there will be probably 1 or 2 other guys in the next year or so leave that room, because like you just talked about, Brandon Ennis hadn't even had a practice. Well, he has now, I'm sure, working out in the summer drills with Ohio State, but he showed up with a big time vehicle. You know why? With his NIL deal, because this guy, just watch the video, ladies and gentlemen. The video does not lie, especially against big time competition like he faced in high school down in Florida. Brandon Ennis is the real deal. There are even guys who established themselves in the spring, I'm sure, if not looking over their shoulder, like you just did, Spencer, they're looking side to side like, okay, who am I out here with? I've got to be better than that guy if I expect to play. And then throw Xavier, like you said, throw Xavier Johnson in the mix, because he's proven himself in a few big situations, definitely against Georgia, for example. I don't know how you really make those decisions. See, the way I would do it, and when we were talking about the running backs, the same way, I'd play all these guys. Some guys get a lot more reps than the other guys, but I play them all because I think they can all sting you, and that's pretty high praise for a group like this.
Andy, I know one guy who will be getting a ton of playing time. That's the best wide receiver in America. This might be the easiest part of the show, where we just get to talk glowingly of Marvin Harrison Jr., but he deserves it. He's a hard worker. He obviously does everything that Ohio State needs him to do. I don't think he is of this world or of this planet. Some of the stuff he does with the football or trying to catch the football, he's just a one of one. And I think it's going to be fun to be able to watch him for another year lead this group, and not have the Jackson Smith and Jigba cloud hanging over the receiver room. This is Marvin's room now.
Yeah. And really the way he bends and contorts his body is incredible to watch. It's almost hard to watch at times. We're like, how did your body not break in that situation? But I think his catch radius is really what makes NFL scouts just so impressed. He can really catch anything that's close to him. He's 6'4". Got a bigger frame than his dad, who was an NFL Hall of Fame wide receiver, of course. And right now he's projected to be a top 3 pick in next year's draft. And the last wide receiver to go that high was Calvin Johnson Jr., who went number 2 to the Detroit Lions in 2007. That's a long time ago. And of course, he ended up being a teamer. And, that's some high praise for a wide receiver. And I think he's gunning for that Blitnikoff. He's a pretty humble guy, but he did reveal a little bit that he felt like he was robbed of that award. And I think he's on a mission to receive that. And it would be pretty cool if he could link up again with his old high school quarterback and Kyle McCord, and they could get going again. I think that's really fun to watch anytime you got the high school quarterback and the high school wide receiver in college continuing their careers together. So if he can make that happen again, anything is possible for Marvin Harrison Jr.
Tim, it's interesting. Last year, and I'm looking at the screen now. I just pulled it up while Andy was talking. I talked to Jackson Smith and Jigba at Lucas Oil Stadium, Big Ten Media Days in July. And some of the quotes in here are pretty crazy from Jackson. My goal is to be better than last year, if that makes sense. Well, it didn't really make sense because it's hard to be better than 1,600 yards receiving, including a record-breaking Rose Bowl. He says he felt better. He felt bigger, faster, and stronger. I think you were about to see that from Jackson. Well, now it's Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka. And the question is, how do you follow up that kind of season? Like, those guys combined for 2,400 yards. And obviously, this room is so much more than just those two. But, that is such an impressive year for both of those guys. It's going to be hard to not compare, is he better than last year? Is he better than this year? Without just looking at the stat sheet. But I do feel like they have a chance to be better, even if maybe the stat sheet doesn't show that they're better. Does that make sense, Tim?
No, it makes total sense. I mean, you know what? You would prefer, if you're a coach, it's not like the good old days where you had the keystone combinations when I was growing up. The quarterback and the wide receiver were as well known. You know what I mean? They were known more as a group, as a duo, than they were for individually. Now it's not the case with these wide open offenses, these widespread offenses. And the bottom line is, what can Marvin Harrison Jr., the threat, do for everybody else on the offense? And like I was, when we talked about the running backs, you put 2 running backs back there and make the defense respect both of them as a threat, along with the quarterback as a runner, which Ohio State really didn't do last year with the running until, like we talked about in the against Georgia, when C.J. Stroud finally decided to run. Oh my goodness, how that opened up things. Just think what that does for a defense trying to handle Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka, one split wide right, one split wide left, and maybe Cade Stover in the slot or Julian Fleming in the slot. How do you deal with that with 2 great running backs in the backfield also? Yes, I think you don't want to ever decide to use Marvin Harrison Jr. as a decoy, because I think the movie Hoosiers, proved to everybody what I've always said, man. When in doubt, go to your best player. Remember when Jimmy Chitwood looks around and goes, "I'll make it." Well, yeah, Marvin Harrison Jr. will make the catch, man. Whether you put him into coverage, whether he's fighting off coverage or whether he's wide open, he's broken wide open. You can count on that guy 99 times out of 100 to make the catch. And so the question now is for Brian Hartline and his group, the offensive staff, is how to exploit Marvin Harrison Jr., both with the great talent he has for catching the ball, and one of the things he took pride in more and more as the year went on last year, yards after the catch, yards after contact. He really took pride in that also. How do you make them have to respect that, or how do you exploit him, but then make the defenses respect that, but also exploit defenses that are trying to take him away? And it's a really nice problem, I think, for this offensive staff to have. And just like you said, he can be as much, if even more effective, and have fewer catches, fewer touchdowns this year than he had a year ago. It's going to be interesting when it's all piled up at the end of the year to see how it played out, because this time of year ago, as you pointed out, I even went up and talked to Jackson Smith and Jigba during the summer when he was working at the Braxton Miller. Wasn't working, but he was working out during the Braxton Miller camp. Ironically, Kyle McCord was throwing in passes, and he said the same things to me pretty much he said to you there, is that you can always improve. You're always looking to get better. You take nothing for granted. You don't listen to a lot of the talk about you being the best in the nation. You just want to be better than you were yesterday. And Marvin Harrison Jr. has got that personified. I mean, he is over the top in his desire to be better today than he was yesterday.
Yeah, it's interesting, Andy, because Brian Hartline talked about Marvin Harrison Jr. What are your goals? Do you want to be better than every college football receiver, or do you want to start to compare yourself to the pros? And I think that's where his motivation is going to come this year. Another guy who has pro aspirations, Brian Hartline's made it known that one of the top 10 receivers returning in the country, even if he's not on those lists, and maybe one of the biggest beneficiaries of a potential Marvin Harrison Jr. decoy situation is going to be Julian Fleming. Andy, if he stays healthy, there's no reason Julian Fleming can't be up there with those guys in that conversation, being one of the top options in college football, wide receiver. And that kind of tells you everything you need to know about this room, is that Julian Fleming is number 3. But that's not to say he's number 3, so to speak, because he'd probably be number 1 anywhere else. So he could have a really good year, and I think that's what we're on pace for. Is, Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to free Julian Fleming up quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think I'm really curious to see how they move all of these guys around, because Ryan Day talked about wanting to put Marvin Harrison Jr. in the slot more, and everyone kind of overreacted about that. But I do think it is important to note, because Marvin Harrison Jr. was in the slot, I think 13.7% of the time last season. And one thing that was talked about a lot with Jackson during the pre-draft process was, well, can he play outside as well? Because he was mainly a slot receiver at Ohio State. And Ryan Day and Brian Hartline and everyone else in the building said, of course he can. But that is something that is questioned by NFL scouts, and something that Ryan Day pays attention to. Yes, they want to win football games, but they also want to set these guys up for success. And you can do both and actually make your team better at the same time. And I think that that's something that's being factored in here. So how much do we see of Marvin in the slot? It makes me think of, I watched a lot of Arizona Cardinals football, and I've seen DeAndre Hopkins moved into the slot. I've seen other bigger framed wide receivers that are typically the sideline to sideline kind of guys that make catches downfield. They can perform in the slot too. The days of, it's always just the smaller wide receivers in the slot, that's over. So curious where they put Marvin, curious where they put Emeka and Julian by extension, and how much they really move those guys around game by game.
Yeah, and that's going to be matchup.
Wait a minute. Of course, Marvin Harrison Jr. can come out of the slot if, in fact, they want. You know what I mean? I mean, I love these pro scouts and stuff. The stuff like you just pointed to there a minute ago, Andy, about the question, finding these little ways to rub, the wrong way, like a Jackson Smith and Jigba or something, to find things to be critical of. Dude, nobody has ever eviscerated a defense the way Jackson Smith and Jigba did Utah in that Rose Bowl. They had no idea what to do with him. They even put their best man on him in that secondary and couldn't cover him. Ohio State even lined him up in the backfield a few times. We're talking about college football, man, where you're just looking for that ideal matchup with a guy like Marvin Harrison Jr. Of course, he can come out of the slot if they want him to. It's almost like these critics sometimes want these guys to almost walk on water. Can he do anything at any time? Well, who can really? But the bottom line is, to think that Marvin Harrison Jr. can't work out of the slot is just ludicrous to me. All this, it's just a different way of looking at things from your landmarks and stuff that you base your patterns on and things like that. He can learn that as well as anybody. I'm sure they're going to have him coming out of the slot a lot this year. They're going to try to mess with defenses' minds with this guy, because you can't even stop him. Georgia couldn't even stop him conventionally. Georgia, with, quote, the best overall defense in the country, end quote, just asked the Philadelphia Eagles. They couldn't stop Marvin Harrison Jr. until they knocked him out, literally knocked him out. And so I'm getting all fired up about this only because I think this guy could do anything you want him to do on the football field. Urban Meyer on Urban Steak that I did with Urban says he's the best football player in the country coming up this year. I totally agree with that. And I think Ohio State is poised to exploit that, and he's willing to go along with that.
Yeah, I think that's why Julian Fleming will be the biggest beneficiary of all this, is that he's going to be open. He can't cover Marvin with just a corner. So Julian Fleming is going to be open. Another guy who can get open because of his speed is Jaden Ballard. Does he earn playing time? That's still an unknown. I think he's going to be competing with Carnell Tate for playing time. I think that's probably fair as well with what we saw from Carnell Tate. High expectations. I'm not going to say that Carnell will be on the field, but at the wide receiver position, conventionally since Brian Hartline took over, Ohio State wide receivers that go on to be really good flash as freshmen. Chris Olave against Michigan, Garrett Wilson against Nebraska and Miami, Ohio, and then in the Fiesta Bowl against Clemson in 2019. Jackson Smith-Njigba in 2020, his first career game against Nebraska with a toe tap touchdown. Julian Fleming against Northwestern in 2020. You saw last year, guys didn't flash, and those freshmen have already almost been, buried on the depth chart. You saw Marvin Harrison and Emeka Egbuka in the Rose Bowl as true freshmen. They flashed. So Carnell Tate, Noah Rogers, Brandon Ennis, if those guys are going to flash, they're going to start to do it as freshmen and then work their way up the depth chart from there, especially with Marvin and Emeka. We can safe to say they're probably going to the NFL after this year. Julian Fleming probably too. New crop coming in, to be the replacements for them. So is it Jaden Ballard behind those guys, or is it Carnell Tate? Because I kind of view Xavier Johnson as almost like the gadget guy who can go anywhere. I don't really put him in the same category as, is he part of the receiver depth chart? Well, of course he is, but he's going to almost be like that mismatch gadget guy that you saw against Georgia, not one of those defined, okay, you're going in for this guy at wide receiver. So I don't really put him in this conversation, but I just think that Jaden Ballard and his progression against Carnell Tate and Noah Rogers, as far as like, well, we know they're going to be really good eventually. How do they manage that, and who finds time on the field when Marvin or Julian need a break? And I just think that's interesting, Tim.
Yeah. I told you I'd play all of them. I mean, they all get reps from the first quarter of the Indiana game on. You obviously can't put them all in there at once. I would scare teams though, man. I mean, you're talking about Tim May. If Tim May was running the show, I'd have five wides. I'd have 5 wides 8 or 10 times a game where they're all big time wide receivers because Ohio State's got them. And I would try to scare defenses. All you got to do, and we'll get to the offensive line, right? Because it's all based on the launch pad. But run four deeps and a deep dig, or 4 takeoffs and a deep dig underneath. How do you cover that defense? And no matter what you decide to do, you're going to leave open a big play, a possible big play. This is the time, just like I said, I want to see 2 of those running backs on the field at the same time. I want to see 5 wides on the field at the same time, and just see how defenses deal with it. And you give Kyle McCord or Devin Brown, but probably Kyle McCord to begin with, you give him time, he's going to have a target to throw to that's going to be pretty open, because college defenses can't handle something like this. I think you exploit what you've got. And Ohio State has a wealth of talent at running back and a wealth of talent at wide receiver. And man, show something, show something you haven't shown before. And I think that's the way you keep people happy too, is that they're figuring in the game plan. If you do what I just said 3 or 4 or 5 times a game, those guys know they're going to play, and it keeps everybody happy. And then you let production, decide the future. You let production decide the future in real games. And I don't know. I'm trying to keep it as short as possible, because I just get kind of excited about looking at the potential last year of the Ohio State offense and this year of this Ohio State offense. I've never seen this kind of skill talent on a team. And I've been covering this team, like you pointed out many times, for 40 years, Spencer. And if they don't exploit it, well, shame on them.
Yeah, Andy, it's interesting because those freshmen are already starting to show, and they probably, again, I talked about this in the running back video, they probably deserve playing time that they might not get as much that they probably deserve. They probably deserve a little more than they're going to get, rather. And that's just the general facts. We've already heard them talk about Brandon Ennis, despite him not even being on campus yet. We've already heard them praise Carnell Tate, despite him only being on campus for a couple months. Those guys are going to need to see the field. In what capacity? I don't know yet. But like Tim said, you get those guys out there and they start producing against Youngstown State and Western Kentucky, you might have to throw them out there for a couple snaps against Notre Dame to see what you got.
Yeah, Noah Rogers, we didn't even mention. He also scored a touchdown in the spring game. Has been quite impressive. And Bryson Rogers as well has turned some heads at times in spring ball. So that whole group is really, really, really impressive. And I guess for my own enjoyment, I'm interested in seeing like who's going to emerge between Carnell Tate and Brandon Ennis. between the two of them, not to pit them against each other. But I do think in terms of playing time, I'll be curious to see, because I don't think they thought Carnell Tate was going to be just as good as he was this spring. Even Brian Hartline said that, like, they thought he was going to be good.
Yeah.
But to accelerate his progression like he did, that was surprising to everyone. And so, the sky's the limit for guys like that impress right from the jump, that remove their black stripe. I do think we'll see him play this year. And, I just think about all the time that final quarter against Georgia when Marvin Harrison Jr. wasn't there. And yes, if he was there, I definitely believe they would have won that game. But that just stresses the importance of depth. You can have all these guys, but it's not just about having guys. It's about having guys that can make a real difference. I think Carnell Tate's one of those guys. Maybe Brandon Innis is too. I haven't seen it yet. But, like, obviously in the college level, I mean. But you have to be able to have those guys to the point where they don't get in a situation like they were last year against Georgia, where they didn't have enough firepower, quite frankly. And you can have all the depth you want, but you need more game changers. And I think they have a few of them that are rising up the depth chart now.
Yeah, and Noah Rogers, like you pointed out, I was in the elevator going down to the field when he had probably the play of the spring game, that catch and run where he ran through about, 4 tackles. Of course, I'm not sure what that says about the Ohio State defense. We'll get into that in one of these other videos. But I digressed. But, yeah, you're right. I mean, you want them ready for prime time. And clearly they lost a spark there when Marvin Harrison Jr. left the game. Xavier Johnson stepped in there big time. But, boy, on that one slant, that really could have made a difference when Marvin Harrison Jr. would have broken back toward the ball, and they would have, kept that drive big time going like he did against Penn State. It was Xavier Johnson trying to make that play, and it didn't happen. And so you're right. I mean, the more you can play these guys earlier, the more you can count on them when you are rubbing the bottom of the barrel, so to speak. But this is a really nice barrel.
It's the most talented position group of any position group in America. And I will stand by that until somebody proves me otherwise. I don't see a reason to back away from that. I will put that in writing here in June and watch it come to fruition in September, August, and November. Marvin Harrison Jr. leads the way. Emeka Egbuka, Julian Fleming. Just the next two. Then you've got all of the talent behind them. By the way, 2024, Ohio State got a pretty good class coming in as well at the wide receiver position. We'll talk about that with Matt Parker at lettermenrow.com, where we talk about Ohio State football and Ohio State football recruiting 365 days a year. This is just 1 week of it. Wide Receivers Week at lettermenrow.com. That's Andy Backstrom. That's Tim May, the 40-year vet. I am Spencer Holbrook. Thanks for watching the latest offseason report, Wide Receivers Week edition, presented by Buyers Auto. We will see you back next week for the offensive line discussion, which I promise is going to be a lot of fun. We'll see you then.